Welcome to today's edition of Rhodes Rage on Freedom Free for All. Over the last 15 years, our skies have been changing, and today we want to look at just what has changed. I am, as many people know, I'm referring to what we see being left in our skies by jet aircraft. Are they simply condensation trails? Nothing more than water vapor? Or could these trails be made of something else? I'm honored today to be joined by Mr. Clifford Carnicom, founder of the Carnicom Institute. Mr. Carnicom has spent more than 15 years researching and documenting these trails. Mr. Carnicom is with us on the line. Let's hear what he has to say. I'm glad you could join us. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, well, I would describe myself basically as an independent researcher. I'm not affiliated with any particular entity other than a nonprofit that I've started about 5 years ago. I do have a background in the technical fields. I worked with the Department of Defense and the Bureau of Land Management as well as the Forest Service for 15 years with a federal career. And worked in geophysics primarily with the Defense Department, gravitational modeling and that type of thing. So my background is fairly strong in the technical sciences. But I'm acting entirely as a independent researcher, as well as president of a nonprofit organization here dedicated. Carnicom Institute is the name of it, and started about 5 years ago, and it's dedicated to environmental and health research and education.
Excellent, excellent. Mr. Carnicom, I would just like, I've been reading numerous official government documents that talk about weather modification and cloud seeding. But it seems that what we're seeing in the sky here these days is something much greater and more widespread than anything that we're seeing in any government documentation. Could you explain in simple terms the physics of contrails and why it appears that we are seeing something different here?
Sure, we're seeing something different because something different is happening ultimately. But, you know, the language here often has become very muddled, and whether that's intentional or not, it may be hard to say, but it certainly obfuscates the issue. And I think what I would do is build this up through three different layers or levels of discussion. And I'll attempt as best as I can to relate it to what we can understand as common citizens. Sometimes I get a little bit too technical because that's my nature, but I'll try to be fair about this. And the first part would be to start with that of a contrail, okay? And a contrail by definition, it's water vapor. This is what it is. It came from the word condensed and trail. And there is history here, and it's helpful to sort of look into this history. I'm 60 years old now, and I've been watching aircraft since I was 12 years old or so. I've always had an interest in aviation. And there was no mystery, and there was no uncertainty that a contrail was indeed water vapor. And that's how those of us my age or so have grown up with that, and we're not surprised by that. Now, to relate that to fairly simple terms, if something truly is water vapor, then that experience and the physics of that are actually rather familiar to us. And the first example I would give to us is if we just have very cold weather outside and we breathe, we have a condensation of water vapor that takes place in front of our face, right? You can see that water vapor from your body, which is hot, which will have similarity or an analogy to an engine here, basically an aircraft. The end products of combustion are basically water and CO2. It's not any different in our body ultimately than it is in a jet engine if you have complete combustion. But this water goes outside of our mouth, and what happens? It condenses in front of our face, and then what happens? What happens is it mixes with the surrounding environment primarily, right? And it's not there very long before it will dissipate. So why is it dissipating? It's dissipating for a couple of reasons, primarily due to mixing, but if there's sufficient basically heat in the atmosphere or source of energy, such as the sun, then it will also basically evaporate. It'll change from a solid to a gaseous state, so you won't see it anymore. This is what happens, and that's a common experience for all of us, right?
Yes, but Mr. Carnicom, I've been hearing other arguments from professionals in the field of climatology that modern aircraft now have design improvements which allow them to fly above the troposphere into the lower stratosphere, whereas before they could only fly in the troposphere. And I'm told that the trails we are seeing are simply due to the updated technology of the new aircraft, and therefore we are just seeing the differences in between the atmospheric conditions in the two separate hemispheres, the strobosphere and the troposphere. So what they're saying is that when the exhaust emissions are mixed into the troposphere, you have a difference in temperature, in gas, in density of air, so the crystals immediately freeze, and they hang around a lot longer, and they reflect the sun differently. Whereas they're saying that it's not the same thing. If you have the same sort of exhaust going into the troposphere, since there's a greater volume and variety of gases which the exhaust is being mixed into, the ice crystals don't stay around as long. What would you say about that sort of argument?
Yeah, I'm going to take issue with that, Brad, in a big way. I'm also going to extend the discussion I just had a little bit more into the subject of clouds, because we'll need to make a distinction between contrails, clouds, and ultimately aerosols, and or a mix between all three of these. These are the three issues that we'll have to get through. And I made it through the first one on contrails, by definition being water vapor. And I'm going to sort of take on your question of this troposphere that I heard you mention, because it actually is surprising to me the way that's been phrased. But if you can, I'd like to now take the second extension of this discussion, and that being to what are clouds. Okay, clouds are not contrails. They're not the same thing. And yet the language has been mixed up in ways where we're sometimes presented as these are being the same thing. They're not the same thing at all. Clouds are not just water vapor. And this is an extremely important distinction. If you look at the formation of clouds, they will require a minimum two things. So a few things will be involved, but two things that they absolutely will require is they will require water vapor, fair enough and sure enough, and at a sufficient level. But they require something else. It's very important for a cloud to form. And that is they require a particle for that water to adhere to. Extremely important difference, that there is a physical particle, a solid particle of some size, very small actually, that the water needs to coalesce around to actually have a water drop in the atmosphere. So clouds are not just water vapor. They require particulate matter, they call them condensation nuclei, in the atmosphere for them to form. So to start by mixing up these two things and calling, quote, contrails clouds, as though there's no distinction, is not true at all. And I would point, if you want a great illustration sometime, but people will go to YouTube and look up this video from a fellow from Chattanooga, Tennessee, a professor down there. And the title of this thing is called Cloud in a Bottle. I'm sure it should be easy for you to find. It's called Cloud in a Bottle. It's about 5 minutes. Watch this guy and watch what he shows you. And he will show you basically how a cloud forms. And he'll use a pop bottle. He'll use a very simple method of a soda pop bottle, a clear one, to show you how a cloud forms. And you will find, after you watch this video, that you will see a very important presentation and distinction related to what I'm seeing. And that is, and not to spoil the punchline entirely, but you will see this guy try to form a cloud, quote, water vapor, condensed water vapor within this bottle when it's perfectly clean. It won't happen. Then he will introduce some smoke. Smoke, i.e. extremely fine particulate matter, right? He will then introduce some smoke into that bottle in addition to the water vapor. And you will see the cloud form, you see? He gives you a very direct visual representation of the distinction between clouds and strictly condensation. So the first thing we have to do is separate out our language and not confuse the two. Because the third level of discussion for us related to your initial question was the question of aerosols, okay? And an aerosol has similarity to that condensation nuclei that I was speaking of, being a particle, because an aerosol is a solid particle. It's a solid particle in gas or in a liquid. Now, one more comment, then I'll try to get to this question on stratosphere and troposphere. But the third level of this discussion will be, number one is contrail being by definition water vapor, right?
Right.
Number two will be an understanding that clouds do not form without the introduction of solid particulate matter, extremely small, but nevertheless necessary for the cloud to form. And the third level will be the issue of an aerosol. Now, the lead-in for a discussion, which we could talk probably for the rest of the night, we won't make it, but the lead-in here will be a question. And the question is, what if you were to artificially introduce extremely fine particulate matter into the atmosphere? The question is, what would be the effect? What would be the impact of that? And I'm giving us a little clue that when you artificially introduce particulate matter into the atmosphere, you have completely changed the normal physics of the atmosphere, because you have now provided a base, or basis, either way you want to speak of it, for, quote, water vapor to coalesce in a fashion that has similarity to cloud formation, if you understand what I'm saying. If you provide material, then you change the physics to where you now allow something that to happen that would not normally happen. And the next part of that question would be, what if you were to do it in an environment that was normally fairly clear and clean? It didn't have such matter, namely the upper atmosphere. And this is where we'll lead into your discussion about the troposphere and such. But what if you were to do that at the higher elevations or altitudes of the atmosphere, where there normally is not material? What would happen? And it's more than a suggestion, but I'm telling us that by doing so, you now provide an environment where you can have basically congregation, coalescing of water vapor around that fine particulate matter and create, quote, clouds. And the clouds have big quotation marks around them here, right? Because they are not normal clouds at all. Right. Because your basis for formation is basically the introduction of particulate matter. And it gets even more interesting when we start asking about what the nature of that particulate matter is and how would that behave, the chemistry and the physics. Not everything's the same, right? Something made out of glass is not the same thing as a soluble salt. So obviously the type of material that you're putting up there can have a huge impact upon the end result. And maybe we'll get into that discussion later about what distinctions there are between various materials and how they might interact, namely the chemistry of them.
Well,
now, go ahead, Brad.
I find it interesting that this argument is given about the two different levels of the atmosphere being so different so as to produce this phenomena, this trail that we're seeing these days. And there's the argument that there's more international flights these days, and that's why we're getting so many of these, higher atmospheric trails. But the question is, how is it that some days we see no trails versus days we see massive grids of trails? Doesn't that seem rather peculiar? And when we're seeing these circular patterns, trails turning off, at one point and starting again at another, these spindly, wispy trails, crisscross trails. How do we have this argument that it's part of the atmosphere where these things are supposed to be occurring like this because we're flying higher in the atmosphere, and yet we have all this other phenomena of breaking and wisping trails that seems to be descending into lower elevations.
Brad, I'm one question behind you all the time. I'm going to catch up with you as we go along.
It is such a hot debate these days.
I'm one question behind you, and that is I want to answer your previous question about the reports of, quote, flying at altitude, okay, or higher altitude. The fact is, it's not the case. If somebody is saying that primary aviation is taking place in the stratosphere, this is false. This is simply false. When you presented this to me, I said, it doesn't exactly make a lot of sense. Let's look into it from the factual standpoint and find out why it doesn't make sense. And here's the reason. The lower layer of the atmosphere is the troposphere. This is the lowest layer. Okay? This layer runs up roughly, let's see, the higher number is roughly, it's about, roughly about 60,000, 50,000 to 60,000 feet, somewhere in there in elevation. You're in Canada, so you folks might be in the meter system, kilometers, right?
Right.
Old Americans here and whatever, we can translate 0.62, but nevertheless, 50 to 60,000 feet in altitude is the troposphere. Now, let's start asking about aviation a little bit. What is happening with aviation? I looked up the altitude history, you know, the breaking of altitude records out of curiosity here. The fact is, in the 1920s, we had the altitude problem figured out. In the 1920s, they were able to fly aircraft. Of course, it was a record, but they were able to fly aircraft at the altitude that aviation has settled in commercially over the decades. And this is roughly 35 to 40,000 feet is where long-range commercial air traffic is flying, okay? Now, when I said the troposphere goes up to 50 to 60,000 feet, and then I state that commercial aviation is happening at 35 to 40,000. By the way, that's the upper flight, okay?
Yeah.
Any of us can fly and just listen to your pilot. But the lower flights will be at 25K, and the upper flights will be 30, 35K, and 40K, 40,000, is extremely high for any kind of aircraft at all in terms of regular commercial and or even military aircraft. So they're right in the upper range of the troposphere. There's the stratosphere, okay? The stratosphere is like, it's 100,000 feet, okay?
It's much larger.
Commercial aviation is not flying in the stratosphere, and there's reasons for this. The reason is there's no air there, okay?
And
there's no air there.
There's the whole argument right there.
I saw a photograph. I'd show, if I had my screen share, I'd show it to you, but I saw the photograph, and they show the photograph of a space shuttle, okay? At the boundary between at the upper limit of the stratosphere. Listen, to claim that civil aviation is happening in the stratosphere, it just doesn't happen. The darn, the SR-71, the reconnaissance plane, the spy planes, that was one of the highest flying aircraft of all times, right, for spying. That thing was flying at 100,000 feet. That is not representative of commercial aviation. So they're not flying in the troposphere. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, but the fact is, it's at the upper boundary of the troposphere because that is where the air should be stable, relatively stable, smooth, low moisture content. This is important because when we start talking about cloud formation, there's a reason you don't have cloud formations in dense levels, at the higher levels of this troposphere, of the atmosphere. And that's because there's no water up there. The moisture level at the upper atmosphere is normally considered very low. I've measured it. You can look at it. The upper atmosphere is actually fairly stable. By upper, I mean troposphere, upper limit of the troposphere. It's a stable environment. This is why they fly there. You don't want weather. You don't want instability. All that happens at the mid-level elevations, like 15,000, 20,000, 10,000, okay? That's where weather is happening. You don't want to be flying through that. And you want to fly where there's enough air to support your airplane, right? So that argument about, changing the environment of aviation doesn't hold. Listen, aviation has been stable for 30 years in terms of where the optimum place is to fly, and they know that. It's at the upper range of the troposphere. So I wanted to answer that question. I'm still trying to catch up with you. I'll try and get there eventually, okay? But then you start asking about, well, how do you have these lines that, go around in circles and turn off and on and form geometric patterns or don't make a whole lot of sense? And you have them because they're happening, and they don't make sense, okay, in terms of commercial aviation. Listen, what's the job of a commercial plane? It's to get from point A to point B, right? It's to get there the quickest and cheapest and safest that you can. It doesn't have the option of running loops around the sky or changing its path abruptly, okay, on a regular basis.
That's true.
So the fact is, the sort of the unusual geometry as well as the location where this activity is happening is not representative of commercial aviation. And it is because there is a artificial alteration of our atmosphere. Ultimately, this is a claim that I will make to you as well as the listening audience. There is a deliberate, systematic alteration of the atmosphere, okay, with the systematic introduction of massive amounts of extremely fine particulate matter, of which we haven't discussed the nature of yet, that chemistry, okay, which is important.
Well,
and it has allowed for a complete transformation of that upper atmospheric environment. And this is why people for the last 2 decades now, a decade and a half, have been screaming for their legislators and for the environmental agencies to basically answer their questions about what's going on, because they have common sense and they understand that their world is being changed and has been changed, and most people do not like their world polluted. At the very least, this is the simplest level, that of pollution, without their consent.
Like I have an article here from rebel.ca dated August 20th of 2013, quoting Dr. David Suzuki saying, many now argue that the best way to protect humanity from the worst effects of global warming is to alter the Earth's natural systems through geoengineering. Then he goes on to say, geoengineering to combat climate change is largely untested. However, we may have to consider it. The implication here being that there's certainly not any geoengineering going on at this time, but that they may have to consider it for the future. So basically, he's saying it's not happening. He backed up this document. He produced another document that I have here. Basically, it's an addendum to the first one, in which he said, I recently wrote about geoengineering as a strategy to deal with climate change and carbon dioxide emissions. That drew comments from people who confuse the scientific process with the unscientific theory of chemtrails. So basically, he seems to be trying to say we're all wet. This isn't happening on this scale. He goes on to say scientists have tested and used cloud and atmospheric seeding for weather modification and consider them as ways to slow global warming. He goes on to say, with so many unknown possible unintended consequences, these practices have the potential to cause harm. Then he goes on to say, but the chemtrail conspiracy theory is much broader, posting that military and commercial airlines are involved in constant and massive daily spraying that is harming the physical and mental health of citizens worldwide. I don't have space to get into the absurdities of belief in a plot that would require worldwide collusion between governments, scientists, airline companies, executive pilots to amass and spray unimaginable amounts of chemtrails from altitudes of 10,000 meters or more. I'm a scientist. I look at credible science. There is no science for the existence of chemtrails. And that's Mr. David Suzuki, a very big icon in Canadian popular culture.
Yeah, I have some comments, because you did send me this article ahead of time, and I do have some comments on this article. But underneath this, I would always say that people need to honor, basically, their own common sense, because we can be told that something is not the case. And there are many occasions we learn that, well, that wasn't exactly the real story. So a person can claim a position of authority and make some type of edict, but you should never lose sight of your common sense. The Americans now understand that every one of their basically communications have been collected into a sieve and filter system for a long time, right, into a decade. But we were told that no such thing was ever happening, right? So just because there is, quote, an authoritative figure that states something doesn't necessarily add any credence to it whatsoever. You have to take your own common sense and do your own research. Now, I'm not a person who is after personalities, but you have given me information. So my comments are not of a personal nature, but you've given me information with Dr. Suzuki's articles, okay? And I've looked these over, and you know, I have some rather strong reactions to them, because when I look at these quote articles, there's no science basis in any of these articles.
Well, will the real scientists please stand up?
Take the history. Take the history of this communication. What I see from a Dr. Suzuki or David Suzuki, again, forget the personality, but what I see is an individual that wrote an article in 2010. And by article, it's like 3 paragraphs to me. It's not what I think of an article. I have roughly 1,200 pages of research over the last 15 years available to the public. That's what I offer, okay? I see about 2 or 3 paragraphs from an individual who does have a certain sense of notoriety in your country. I understand that.
Profound sense of notoriety, actually.
But when I read the article, what the article says in 2010, he makes a statement basically saying geoengineering is insane. This is what the first part, 2010, a statement that geoengineering is insane. Okay? Now, that sort of speaks for itself, that this individual is making a rather strong statement that this may not be the best thing for the planet to artificially manipulate it in terms of changing whether it's the atmosphere or however you're going to do it. But geoengineering is basically the artificial manipulation and design of systems to affect the Earth. Okay, that's what it is. Now, in 2013, he writes this next article, and he writes it in September of 2013. Okay, and in this article, it's where you're citing.
Right.
And what we notice there is a rather distinct sort of turn of sentiment in that article, where he basically says you know, I think we need to consider this. His actual
blatantly
statement
says that.
is,
yeah.
Right. His statement is basically, oh man, where is it? Nevertheless, he basically is saying that we must now consider geoengineering. Now, I don't view this as a science article at all, particularly. He quotes about 2 or 3 people that list certain strategies. But when I think about science, I think as people who do original research. The scientific method is based upon direct observation and analysis. This is what true science is based on. There is none in this particular article. It's simply, it's really more of a psychological article than anything when you look at it, because there's basically a characterization of people. This is a sentence. This came in August 2013. So 3 years later, he writes a statement that says, as you said, largely untested. Because we've stalled so long on reducing carbon emissions and still aren't doing enough, we may have to consider it, all right? So in 3 years, you have a change of sentiment. I personally don't have an explanation for the change in sentiment, but I would say there's a dearth of material in between, because I don't see any basis of science for it. Now, the one that disturbs me the most is the article that comes 1 month later. That second one was August 2013. Now you have a letter written in September of 2013. Now, this article is rather classic because there's truly no science in this article. If you read this, I looked through this, and the language here, it's basically full of psychological characterization of individuals as opposed to any type of science. And I'll go through a couple of these examples, okay? And language is very important, because language is used to basically influence and manipulate people. Can be used to manipulate, but definitely used to influence people's perception of events. Here's one of his opening lines, okay? He says, chemtrail believers. Actually, he even starts off, he says the unscientific theory of chemtrails. I'm going to run through these very quickly. First off, if you're dealing in the scientific world, I don't use the word chemtrails, okay?
Right.
I do not, because it has no scientific definition.
Right.
So there is no unscientific theory of chemtrails. There is no definition for the word, basically.
Right.
And it's problematic in its own sense. So if you're going to say you're claiming to be a scientist, then at least focus on the science of the issue. The second phrase that he continues with, he says, chemtrail believers claim governments. Now, I don't know about other individuals, but I don't operate upon belief. I have 15 years, basically, of scientific observation and analysis offered from the standpoint of an independent citizen to provide the public with information to make them aware of this artificial transformation of their environment that has taken place, which has numerous implications and consequence, both for the health of this planet, everything that dwells upon it, as well as our own health. This is not a belief system. And when you use this language without justifying it with any adequate science, then it has very little standing from my standpoint, okay? I cannot attach a great deal of substance to these type of statements, but I do recognize the use of language in an attempt to, let's say, develop and influence people's perceptions of an issue without addressing the real issue.
I would say this is perception management for sure. Yeah.
Now,
this is...
here's the next line, okay? The next line says, and this is not in order, I mean, this is not in sequence, but these are the openings of several paragraphs. The next opening to a paragraph is, he says, that I don't have space to get into the absurdities of belief in our plot. Now, take this language again, okay? Take what happens. He says that he doesn't have time. And again, this is not a critique of a personality, but this is a critique of information. This individual says that he doesn't have the time or space to get into the actual information about the issue, okay?
Right.
When all that I see over a 3-year period is basically 6 paragraphs of production, none of it particularly focused on any original science of any kind or reporting.
Yeah, I have the same article right here. It's just, yeah, I was quoting
and then again the word of belief, right? I do not have space to get into the absurdities of belief. Again, implying that it's a belief system. And in fact, if you read this article, it has very much the connotation of basically describing individuals that have concern about this issue as somehow adhering basically to their own form of religion. Religion is about belief. Religion is about denial, okay? Religion is about mass, basically, perception of events that you cannot truly observe or understand. This is a characterization of his article. Now, I will say, in direct contest to this, if this individual does not have time or space to discover this, I do.
Would you,
and I have.
Excuse
and
me,
I
Mr. Carnicom.
Go ahead.
Would you be willing to debate Mr. Suzuki if the opportunity could be arranged?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I'm not a person that seeks, let's say, contest, but I am a person that seeks rational discussion and open disclosure.
Well, I think that's what's warranted, and that's why I was wondering.
And again, I don't have an objection. I'm not, again, this is not about personalities, but this article,
this person is coming out and saying that, I've got the article right here, and he says the science is clear. Human-caused climate change is the most pressing threat to humanity. We must work to resolve it. We don't have time for debunked conspiracy theories. So is what you're talking about a debunked conspiracy theory, Mr. Carnicom?
I don't even use the word. Okay, here's another one for you, okay? The use of the term conspiracy is obviously very directed over the past decade again to manipulate or to influence. Just the word. Wait, there is a certain image that comes to mind when you use the word conspiracy, right?
Yeah.
Now, here's how I take it, because I'm of a person that basically looks at my world as what I at least think is in a fairly objective and rational mode, and I don't have an agenda here, all right? But if you go to your dictionary and look up what conspiracy is about, okay? And a conspiracy is a plan. It's a plan to conduct basically a crime, okay? Here is my issue with this word. We're not speaking about a plan to organize some effort. My word that I use, at this time, I've been in this for 15 years in terms of watching and studying what has happened to our world. My word is crime. Conspiracy was when you plan to execute a crime.
Right.
My statement, and this is not a belief statement, this is my factual interpretation, a crime has been committed. It is a crime, it is not a conspiracy.
Well, these people seem to be telling us to listen to them and believe what they have to say, regardless as to what we see with our own eyes or anything else. And it's basically, they seem to be claiming the authority to tell us what is true and what is false, and you're not to argue with them because they are the official scientific establishment.
One of the roles of government, right, is to basically, you could call it influence, control, manipulate, whatever level you wish to, basically public behavior and perception, is it not? And so it is necessary, basically, for those that have that need to basically act from a standpoint of authority. But you know, where we're coming from tonight, as I understand it, is basically the willingness of the individual to look honestly at the changes and alterations that are taking place in our environment, and trust your own good common sense, and you do your research to your heart's content if you want. I've done it for 15 years, and I have quite a library of material available for people to study, and they can decide what's true or not.
Excellent. You know, people are saying they express their skepticism, saying, "Come on, you know, aluminum or barium falling from the skies. Show me the evidence." You know, so let's look at what sort of evidence you have based on your research. What would you say we are actually looking at in these trails?
Okay, let's. Okay, first thing is to be aware that such papers exist. Okay, if you go to the institute site, carnicominstitute.org, and you go to that site and you click on the link that says Research Library, you will find a library of 15 years of research work. And in that library, you will have roughly 300 plus papers that are based upon either direct observation or analysis of this world around me. Okay? Now, that work starts in 1999, and it has a rather complex evolution of information on it. But the early years, the very first 2 years or so, were spent simply on photographing. Listen, if something is unusual, what does the person do? You record it, right? If you think something is happening that's unusual in your world, you record it. So I spent 2 years roughly photographing, working with photography and just saying, hey, this looks like it's off, something's wrong here. I call attention to it. That's my job, right? And there's an evolution that takes place here. And we're still speaking of the very early years, but then there's a stage where you start to ask, well, you know, the next, first of all, you document, you call attention, say, hey, looks like something's happening here that's wrong. Then what happens, you seek out responses from, quote, the individuals in authority and the public officials to answer your concern, right? This is the next stage.
Right.
And there is a history of that occurring, not just by me, but basically the public. You have years where people were basically calling and saying, something is wrong here, I request an investigation, and they expected such a response. That response has been documented, at least in part, on my website, and
right.
The response was woefully insufficient, right? Okay, so then you have the lack of response when it was appropriate to respond by those in positions of being able to respond. Doesn't happen. So what is necessary then? What is necessary then is that the citizens now have to start taking that call. Citizens have to now try to perform the duties and services of those that have the resources that are unwilling to do so. So already the citizens are in a highly disadvantaged position, right? But if they're committed to what they do, they will pursue it. And this is what I did for several years. And again, we're still in the very early part of the work because we're not at the stage of talking about analysis. But in answer to your question, you will find scores and scores of papers written based upon direct observation and sampling of the environment, meaning what? Meaning air and water, particularly soil, air, water, and soil, by me as an independent citizen out of necessity. Not because it's the right way to do the work, but it's done because it was necessary, because there was no adequate response. Now, that history is completely laid out in terms of what I was able to find. Now, one of my strongest positions is that the citizen should never have to be in this position. It is not the calling of the citizen to perform the duties which require really resources that are only available through the system which we have set up in society, and that is basically a taxation system, right, that funds and provides for services at governmental levels and environmental levels to do the very work we're speaking of. So I did my best, is all I can say. People can look at that work and they can judge. I'll give you a summary of some of that early work in terms of what it found. That work found three main classes, 3 to 4 main classes of materials. Now, when we started this conversation today, I also hinted that the nature of those particulate matter, that particulate matter that you're introducing into the atmosphere, that's important. Not all things are the same, right? So when I say this statement here, you want to keep in mind that there's more to the story, and that is when I say particulate matter, well, the big question is what's it made of? But here would be 3 to 4 categories of materials that were found over the years. The first would be that of, here's a loaded phrase for us, but hopefully we'll make sense of it. The phrase is that of ionizable metallic salts. This is one of my primary findings, that we appear to have the introduction of extremely fine particulate matter, that it has the characteristic of being ionizable. This means something that can be charged electrically. Ionizable metallic salts. Okay, we can talk about them more, but this would be number 1. The second category would be that of a very unusual filament nature, most unusual material. Extremely fine filament nature, airborne filament. And by the way, people will make their objection that, I'm not sampling at 40,000 feet from aircraft. Listen, that's a fact. I'm a human being. I have my resources. I'm planted on Earth. I don't have access to aviation equipment at 40,000 feet. I do what I can. Right. I can get up to 10,000 feet on the mountains, and I do that. But I do what I can. And yes, my sampling is from the ground. But sorry, folks, gravity works. Everything does come down eventually. It might take a while, but it all comes down eventually. The second class of materials is this extremely fine filament. Now, to put this in perspective, your human hair, you have more hair than I do. I have a little bit left. But human hair is roughly 60 to 100 microns in thickness. This is a sense of scale, 60 to 100 microns. Asbestos fibers are about 2 microns in thickness. Now, many of us are aware of the environmental issues that went along with the presence of asbestos in our environment, right? And the huge mitigation programs that were in place to reduce the presence of asbestos. Why? Because of its hazard, right? Extremely fine filament, non-digestible. It's basically mineral, so it's very bad for the inside of the system, right? Respiratory system. All right. That filament is 2 microns, roughly thick. By the way, filaments in our clothes and spiders are in the neighborhood of 7 to 12 microns. Okay, here's one for you. The filament that we're speaking of, this airborne filament that has been documented over and over and over and continues to this day, the Institute has a research project going on involving these filaments. And this filament has well over a decade and a half history. But these filaments are sub-micron in nature, okay? Less than a micron. And as a matter of fact, this is very recent information, just over the last 3 or 4 months. I've known that this is likely the case, but it wasn't until 3 or 4 months ago that I actually received electron microphotographs for the first time.
Oh, really?
I've been waiting for 15 years for them. It's difficult for citizens to have access, let's say, to the necessary information. It's not unknown what we need to know. What is unavailable are the resources to get the work done. But I was able to receive electron microphotographs of this very material that I speak of. Not only is it submicron, the fact is it is in what's called the nanometer range. And people that know my work, they will know that I have a reluctance to use the word nanotechnology with respect to this work, because I know that you need an electron microscope to see it, and I've never had one. Okay, right. So I've had to use the word submicron.
Right.
Well, this information, I do know that these filaments measure rough. Smallest one looks like about 200 to 300 nanometers. This means 1/10 to 2/10 of a micron. So can you imagine? Take your human hair at 60 to 100 microns. Go to your asbestos fiber, which is 2 microns, and think of all the problems that were associated with non-digestible, non-soluble filaments in the environment as asbestos. And now jump down to something that is 1 to 2/10 of a micron, repeatedly found in the environment, with no proper explanation for it, know that it's airborne, collected in numerous locations, not only in this country, but now across the world, documented to be collected across the world, and no adequate response. Now, to give you, this is only number 2, right? We're only making it to number 2 so far. But this filament has a very important history in that this material back in 1999 was sent to the United States Environmental Protection Agency for the purpose of identification on behalf of the public. Very interesting history, but if you look into that case, the material was sent by certified mail. The EPA refused to acknowledge that sample. They did not say anything. They took the letter and just said, hey, we don't know anything about what's going on, but they never even acknowledged receipt of that material. They kept it for a year and a half. The Freedom of Information Act was filed by a third party, a year and a half with absolutely no response. A year and a half later with the Freedom of Information Act, they return that sample and say, we have no obligation to do anything. This is what happened with this filament material. It goes back to 1999. It's going to end up being very important in our discussion to Dr. Suzuki or David Suzuki. At some point, we'll want to do a little bit of examination about this filament and the role that it currently is playing in the health of the general population across the planet. It's a very serious issue that we're talking about, and it remains an important topic of research and current topic. Number 3 on our list, biologicals.
I beg your pardon?
Biologicals.
Yes.
You have asked me what types of materials are being found in the analysis of environmental samples a year, right?
Right.
First one was the ionizable metallic salts, of which we could have a discussion for a couple hours on that. Second is an extremely unusual filament nature that was refused for identification by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, okay? That has very important ramifications with respect to health, as if we had more time to discuss it. And the third will be that of biologicals. Now, what do I mean by biologicals? This is a very serious subject that most of us are not really willing or wanting to hear about. But the fact is, if you look at those papers and reports over the years, you will find, again, dozens to scores of papers that document the existence of what you would call, I'll say it this way to be diplomatic first, unusual biological components is my phrase of choice. Unusual biological components.
Okay.
Now, what does that mean? There is something called an erythrocyte, and this will be hard for people to deal with, but I go by the facts. I go by what this thing called an erythrocyte is a red blood cell. This is what it is. An erythrocyte is a red blood cell. Okay. If you look at these reports, you will find the repeated detection of what is, by the best available analysis and observation I can make over a sustained period of time, multiple studies and observations, of the existence of what you would call a freeze-dried or a desiccated erythrocytic form within the samples. And by the way, that filament, that sample I was talking to you about, the EPA, that they refused to identify, guess what was a part of that observation? The existence of unusual biological components within that sample.
So you got no response, is what you're saying.
Yeah, they had it for a year and a half, and then they turned it back and said we don't have any obligation to do anything. Okay, so
why are we getting all these institutions that are supposed to be respected for their service to the community, and we're getting nothing from them? I mean, on such a wide scale. Why is that? How is that possible? Why is your work so unique and unheard of in common society?
There are, what would you say? There is information, there are programs, there are operations, there are systems in place that the public, let's say, deserves to know about by the judgment of people that create, develop, and manage those systems, right? There is a body of information that these bodies of government believe and feel that the public has the right to know. There are systems, there are programs, there are operations, there are methods that it is also deemed that the public does really not have the right to know. Okay, Now, I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying this is a fact of life.
Who has the right to make these decisions?
Well, these are great questions, right? These are great questions that we should all be asking. And what would be the basis of these decisions? What's reasonable and what's not reasonable, right? And there is a very important line that is to be crossed when you're trying to answer this question. And one of those questions will be, is this call it a covert operation, or is this an open operation, okay?
Well, I think it's pretty covert because nobody's talking about it, and it seems to be taking place.
Be absolutely my conclusion as well, Brad, but there are those that say there is no issue here whatsoever.
Clearly, that's what Mr. Suzuki is saying, exactly.
And this issue is really just about global warming, and don't be concerned. And it's probably, it's for your benefit, but it's really best that you don't even know about it. Okay, I don't follow that line of reasoning because it doesn't compute with me. If something's for my benefit, then I would think that such a party would want to tell me about it.
You'd think.
If one doesn't tell you about it, it would make you ask a question as to why am I not being told about it.
Indeed.
But when you ask why do they not respond? I have made the conclusion that this indeed is a covert operation, okay? We don't even know the extent necessarily of, quote, those in position of authority about how much, quote, control they even have.
Or knowledge they even have. I think it's probably a need-to-know basis, I would imagine.
Extent of this, but there are such systems in place, and people say, well, how could such a thing be? How could somebody say anything, okay?
That's the sort of feedback I get.
I'll give you the simplest example in the world I can give, and if I was running the show, listen, I would design the ship so, loose ships sink lips, right? So that no word gets out, or else it's not successful as a covert operation. The simplest example I can give to anyone, and I can ask you, was the atomic bomb a covert operation? And I can also ask you, did the atomic bomb by the United States, did that project succeed? Quote, this is not about right or wrong, right? But, quote, having an objective and a mission, did they succeed? Did they successfully manage a covert operation?
Right.
Such that,
the Manhattan Project?
Yes. Was it conducted successfully? Of course it was.
Clearly.
Okay. Don't tell me it can't be done, because
Right.
it was done. It was done 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And if the stakes are higher, listen, the whole world is full of covert operations. It's now become basically a duplicate part of our lives. Look at the darn phone issue I was talking about. I knew over a decade and a half ago that every communication in this world was brought into a computer system. I know that from my own instincts as well as observation. Now we know it. Why? Because some individual comes out and tells you? Is that when you know it? If you're alert and aware of your environment, you can make judgments again for yourself as to what you know to be true or not to be true. The facts speak for themselves. Those that have been called upon to do their duty to basically investigate the issues of environmental damage, and this is the mildest level I can say it, have been called upon to do their duty, and they have failed woefully and completely in doing so. The issue is much more involved than an issue of pollution, and we don't have time to get into tonight the issues of health, and how the general population shows itself likely to be affected by this in a way they don't begin to understand right now. But nevertheless, at the simplest level of examining a source of undesirable pollution in our environment, the authorities have not responded. Those are the facts.
Yeah.
People decide what they want to do.
They won't even admit that anything's going on at all.
So they didn't admit your phone was being tapped either, right?
Right.
Okay, so what's true? Who, this is not meant to you, of course, individually necessarily, but the question is, rhetorically, who do you think is responsible for telling you the truth or for discovery of the truth? Who is that? Is it some separate person from yourself? Is it some higher government official that is responsible?
Well, people do defer to authority figures, unfortunately, when it comes to what they consider true or not. and that seems to be what they're doing here, is they're trying to sort of circle the wagons and saying anybody that suggests that there's a massive campaign to spread unidentified particulate matter in the sky is crazy.
Great phrase in the Constitution there. Somewhere I would believe it should be the Constitution. There's a phrase to the effect that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. What a wonderful phrase, right?
Yeah.
What a wonderful phrase of truth. When we say we defer to something, right? Then we're truly not owning up to our responsibility. Not to get on the political bandwagon, but these issues are important. These social mores underlie the why of how things are happening without people acting assertively and responsibly to basically manage their world by deferring, right, to those of authority. What we're saying there, and it's written in the Constitution if you believe those words, that the actual power that such an entity has only exists because of your consent, okay?
Right.
Now, when do people realize that there's a mutual responsibility there, right? If you're consenting, then you're saying, I am willingly allowing myself to be governed because I have trust and faith in you,
right,
to act responsible, right?
Right.
And what's the conclusion? If you're not acting faithfully and responsible, right, and dutiful, then by those words, if you believe in them, then there actually is no power. The power is false, okay? The power is not earned. We could say that at least, right? The power has not been earned if you are not fulfilling your duties to serve the public from the standpoint. And therefore, the responsibility and falls upon the individual to no longer acquiesce, right? But I want to thank you basically for making the opportunity available to speak. And, hopefully out of this can also come a greater sense of coordination between the Canadian side and the United States side. There is an international awareness here. It's not coordinated.
Well, I would love to have you up here, Clifford, in British Columbia, and debate our very famous scientist, Mr. David Suzuki, one-to-one. I don't think one can underestimate the difficulty the public have with iconic figures such. It's like a father authority to people, and they do unfortunately defer their better logic and intelligence to authority figures. And it seems obvious to me they're coming out and trying to poo-poo your work and the things we're trying to point out quite deliberately, and in a manner which is conducive to perception management in the public. And it's deliberate, and I do believe we have to confront this sort of deliberate deception that I see going on in the media world.